This is your Essential Business Briefing. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up, no ordinary recovery. We delve into the OECD's latest economic outlook for the good news and the warning signs for the global economy. On the verge of a new global tax deal, there are hopes of a breakthrough in overhauling how big international companies pay their taxes. And making every square metre count, the changing face of Paris's underground car parks during the pandemic. We are at a critical stage of our recovery from the Covid-19 pandemic, so says the latest economic snapshot from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's predicting a stronger recovery for global growth this year, with almost 6% expansion and 4.4% next year. The picture for the United States and the Eurozone is brighter than the organisation's last forecast, but it's warning that the global recovery will be unequal. Let's speak now to the OECD's Chief Economist Laurence Boone. Laurence, thanks for being with us. You're talking about an uneven recovery from this crisis. How big is the difference between those countries that are recovering faster and those that are much further behind?
There are two reasons why there is this difference in the recovery. Some countries are vaccinating very fast, reopening their economies, and they were able to provide a lot of monetary and fiscal support so that when they reopen, they function nearly, and I insist on the nearly, normally. And other countries are not vaccinating as fast, had difficulties managing the virus, and cannot afford the same type of monetary and fiscal policy support. And obviously, that it's more difficult for them, more challenging. So, for example, on the countries recovering very fast, you have the US, which is already back to the level of GDP it was at pre-pandemic. Then you've got a block of countries, like mostly European, where it will take another 6 months to 12 months in some instances before they're back into the 2019 situation. And then other countries like emerging markets are very dependent on tourism and other contact-intensive services. For them, it's going to take 3, perhaps 4, even in some cases 5 years before they get back to where they were in 2019.
So what's the risk then with this divergence between those that are back like the US and those that will take a bit longer?
As long as the planet is not vaccinated, there is a risk that the virus mutates, that it becomes immune to vaccines or becomes more lethal. And as long as it circulates somewhere, no country is protected from that. So that's the first risk and the biggest one. The second one is this is disrupting the way the global economy functions. It's disrupting the global production. You know, there's the harbors cannot function properly. You cannot load and unload stuff as you were doing before. Some production sites do not function properly. So it's creating disruptions and tensions and favoring price increases. And the third risk is these imbalances, you know, with some countries lagging behind when they were catching up. The big risk there is that some capital flows away from them towards countries which are in a better position, and that would create not only some exchange rate movement, but also financial market volatility, and more importantly, harm the people who live in those countries.
There are governments in some parts of the world that are already starting to unwind their special pandemic support measures. How do they get that balance right between not taking it away too fast, but also not letting it run for too long?
So our advice is look at it in three phases. The first one was the emergency phase. There was blanket support wherever it was possible to a very large number of people and firms, and that was appropriate. Now, where most countries are in the OECD is in this transition period where economies are reopening, but still some activities are closed. And here what we're saying is actually shift fiscal support to target it towards those who remain in impaired sectors or who need it most, and start investing because financial conditions are very favorable. So invest in climate, invest in digital, invest in health and education. That's super important. And then when the economies will be back at full employment or close to full employment, then they should start looking at their public finances and think hard about, you know, the design and the management of their finances, whether they need to change the composition of taxes and spending, reduce some, increase others, but only when they're back at or close to full employment.
We keep being told not to worry about the debt that countries have taken on for the moment. Are there places that do need to worry more than others, or will that become a concern soon, do you think?
I think, one of the key lesson, I think, from this crisis, not only is that we were probably not well prepared and we will need to address the health and education afterwards, but also that the debt issue is not so much due to the COVID crisis. The debt issue is a legacy of the past decades, right? Those countries which had well-managed public finances, they were able to provide the support that is needed, and they are not putting their finances in peril at all. Those countries where they had been spending slippages for, again, 2, 3, or 4 decades, and the same with taxes, then those countries, as I was saying, in the third phase, they need to think really hard on how to prioritize spending, how to make their tax system fair and progressive, and calibrate their tax system to the spending that they think is desirable.
There are talks going on about international tax reform. The OECD has been very involved in this issue. Is that something that could help countries out of this crisis if there is a new deal on global corporate tax?
So as the new Secretary General of the OECD was saying yesterday, he's quietly optimistic. I think what's very important with this is, with the new models of digitalization, how business are able to use that in the way that they operate. Perhaps they have not always paid their fair share of taxes where they owe this fair share of taxes. And this negotiation will help rebalance this. And I think from an economic, social, and also fairness point of view, it's super important.
We've spoken before about how this pandemic has affected young people particularly hard. Is there any hope or any policy action that governments should be taking now to compensate for how difficult it's been for young people in OECD countries?
So it's true that recessions do affect young people harder, or at least, it's a population who's particularly vulnerable in recessions in general, but in this one especially, because the most affected sectors like tourism, events, travel, leisure, these are the tourism that employ a high proportion of young people, quite often with low qualification and very precarious contracts. And also what we see is that in recessions, when you graduate, it's difficult to access the labor market in good condition. So what we're saying is a number of things. The first thing is, try and help those people who need to retrain, and most of the time in firms. If they left school early, that's because they want to work. So apprenticeship, for example, internship is super important to help them. And for those, we're also suggesting some wage subsidies. That's very, very helpful. And then we've said it before, but I think public employment services in many, many countries can be geared up towards helping much better the young people to find the appropriate job, to equip them with the skills that firms are demanding. I think it's not only a public policy issue, it's a public policy and private partnership issue.
Okay, Laurence Boone, Chief Economist of the OECD, thank you very much for speaking to us. Now, politicians from the G7 group of large economies will be discussing plans for international tax reform at a series of meetings in Britain. The issue has been the subject of fierce debate for years now, but after the United States announced its support for a global minimum tax on big companies, it appears a deal is more likely. Before the G7 finance ministers gathered, the World Economic Forum held a virtual discussion on this issue. Alex Cobham from the Tax Justice Network outlined what's at stake.
15% would be a step forward. It would still, we think, bring in more than $250 billion of new revenues, and that would make it the biggest change in 100 years of international tax rules. If they go to 21%, or even better to 25%, we're talking $500, $600, $700 billion. The sort of money that, when you're thinking about perhaps 50 billion needed for COVAX, or the amounts to invest in public health systems in lower income countries, suddenly this is really game-changing. But the question that's left, apart from the rate, is who's going to get the benefit of this? Under the OECD proposals, the G7 countries themselves would get about 60% of those additional revenues, and that doesn't leave much for anyone else. There are fairer ways, and we've proposed one of them. if they go forward with one of these fairways, I think this could really be the biggest shift in the global inequalities in taxing rights for a generation, and it would set the basis for building back better in a really genuine way.
In a densely populated city like Paris, every square metre of space is considered prime property. Under the French capital streets, there are tens of thousands of car parking spaces. With the pandemic, there's been less demand for them, so some have been given a new lease of life. Georgina Robertson reports.
Below the streets of Paris, kilometre after kilometre of car parks. 1 in 4 spaces in the French capital are currently sitting empty, and some companies are seeing it as an opportunity. Here, a delivery company has converted an empty car park into a distribution centre. The company believes it was a good investment.
Le fait de gagner peut-être 1 heure de transport en étant au cœur de ville, eh bien nous allons gagner dans Paris intramuros par exemple une quinzaine de points de distribution. Et donc ça permet sur un même temps de travail pour nos chauffeurs eh bien de distribuer un maximum de colis et donc de baisser les coûts de distribution.
In another Paris car park, a supermarket has set up a depot for its deliveries. The rent paid is helping the parking company to stem its losses.
Si on avait à faire le choix entre du stationnement et une activité de ce type, le stationnement serait plus rentable. Mais on ne raisonne pas ainsi. Les places sont disponibles. Donc tout ce qu'on y installe vient, entre guillemets, en plus, se confronte à une situation où les places sont disponibles et sont vides. Donc c'est forcément plus rentable que de remplir les espaces que de les laisser vides.
This hotel manager is tapping the potential income of his car park by installing extra bike racks.
Aujourd'hui, ce sont des revenus pour les hôteliers. Donc que ce soit des vélos, des voitures électriques ou des voitures thermiques, c'est une location d'une place de parking. Donc ça revient au même. La seule chose, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, il y a peut-être plus de vélos qu'il y a de voitures.
According to one study, the equivalent of 100 hectares of parking spaces, both above and below ground, could be repurposed in the French capital alone.
That's all from us for now, but you can find all of our previous episodes on the France 24 website. And you can get in touch on social media with your comments or questions. Until next time, thanks for watching.